Hey, so now that we've talked about the introduction and the basics of why we master in the first place, let's talk about what we need to do to prepare for this process. So this is generally called our mixdown phase or our pre-mastering phase, right? And so I like to think of pre-mastering as essentially our final stereo mix, right? Our final stereo mixing session before we head over to the mastering process. I generally like to master my audio in a different file than the actual ton going through the field, but a great master cannot fix a bad mix. If anything, a great master will expose the problems of a really bad mix. So some engineers actually do a little fake mastering before they finish mixing so they can actually hear the problems that still exist. Things like frequency balancing, stereo width problems, and just other issues that you may not have heard when you were mixing, but that really pop out in the mastering process. And here's another thing. A great mastering engineer, like a top-notch level one, they won't even touch a bad mix. If you try and give them a bad mix for them to master, they'll say, no, I'm not working with this, fix this, that, and the other thing, then come back to me. So it's really important to get that final mix down just right so you have a good mastering session and process. All right, so here are some of the things that you want to do when you're in this pre-mastering mix-down process. All right, so first of all, check for clarity and balance. Can you hear everything? And are all the individual elements properly balanced with one another? Right? Is your low frequency relationship tight? And does your low frequency relationship work with the mid-range, and does that work with the high end? And as a whole, does your track have life and energy, or are you missing perhaps energy in a certain frequency band or among a certain set of instruments? These are the questions to ask. Of course, we want to try and, get rid of clicks, pops, any distortion that maybe you missed in the editing process or have been brought out through the mixing process. Sometimes when we add effects, when we boost levels, make these kinds of adjustments, we end up hearing errors like clicks and pops, hums, distortions that we couldn't hear before. We also sometimes add these errors because through effect processing in plugins, sometimes these audio artifacts get into the final product, right? And then this is a big one, clipping. You can't clip going out of the mastering stage. If anything, you want to leave a ton of headroom, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, right? Some other important things when it comes to this mastering and mix down process, at this stage, you want to avoid adding any kind of dynamic processing, especially compression, to the master track, right? Try and avoid doing that because that's really the role of the mastering engineer. Even limiters too. Leave that master fader track alone. Just make sure you leave enough headroom for those kind of processes to happen in the mastering stage. Think about it this way. You don't want to get in the way of the mastering engineer's work, especially since we generally pay a lot of money to get songs mastered. So you don't want to thwart their efforts by doing unnecessary dynamics processing and not leaving them enough headroom. All right? So when I'm talking about headroom, I'm essentially talking about this master fader track and any track in general, and the amount of space we leave, right, for healthy signal to continue to get louder and grow. An important part of the mastering process is to bring the audio to a competitive audio level. essentially making it as loud as possible, or at least as loud as the other commercial audio standards are. So to do so, you really need this headroom for the audio mastering engineer to be available for them to actually make the audio level louder. If in the mixing stage you're already maxed out to the point where you're almost distorting, or you are, how is there any possible room for the mastering engineer to make your track louder, right? With limiters, with compressors, and the different types of plugins that they use. So this is what's important, and this is what is meant when it's said, make sure you leave headroom, all right? We're basically talking about having a healthy level of signal, but leaving about -6 or at least -3 dB of headroom. I always try and shoot for -6 because the more room, the merrier, right? But if you can at least save -3 dBs worth of space, that'll go a long way to making sure that you can have the master possible. All right, so as you're pre-mastering your multi-check, just remember this little checklist I introduced, right? Take a moment, and I would say shut off your screen. This is the time you want to use your ears. Don't get trapped with using your eyes and the meters, and listen. Listen a few times. Take a little break too in between your mixing, your final mixing session and mastering section, so you get a little objectivity as well. And just listen and ask these questions, and just make sure that you are doing the best job to make sure that the mastering engineer can do their best job, even if it's you. All right, so what I'll do now is we'll hop into Pro Tools, okay? And I'll show you just some of the things that I consider when I'm finishing up a multi-track mix. Okay, so I have this run session open. We saw this earlier in, I believe, the mixing session and the high-end and mid-range mixing session. All right. So let's pretend, and this is not the case, let's pretend that I did my final mix. I'm like, yeah, this rocks. I think it's ready. But before I do that, I want to make some checks, right? For instance, I'm seeing here some little blips and clicks that maybe weren't there before, but were brought out by some of the effect processing. So these are the types of things I want to go and finish, right, and take care of. So just keep in mind that. But let's head over to this mixing window here, because I think this is really important. So again, my main goal is that I don't want to touch this master fader track. Leave it at 0. That's how you have an objective measure. If you remember from when I was first demonstrating this song, I used a reference track. So something that's been very helpful to me with trying to finalize this mix is going back and forth between this Stephen Marley reference track and then my track to try and get the balance and the relationship similar. Right? Notice that I don't have a limiter. I don't have any plugins on this master fader track. To me, this is not the time for that. And please remember, this is not the time to try and make your audio as loud as it can be. That's the mastering stage. This is all about mixing, balance, and making sure these individual elements really come together. All right. So I'll just play a little snippet of the song to refresh your memory. And remember, this mix is not perfect. And if anything, the mastering process will show us the flaws in this mix, which is sometimes a useful feature of mastering. Okay, so I feel that I can hear everything at this point. I have the balance to where I like. If you remember in this unit, I talked about creating submixes. And to me, in this pre-mastering mixdown phase, this is really where the submixes, I think, come into great effect. Because at this point, I'm really happy with the way my individual tracks sound. And now I can just make small adjustments to the overall sound. I could say, oh, I wish the drums were a little bit louder. The guitar could duck down a little bit more, and the vocals could be, maybe a little bit more prominent. And I can make these finer tune adjustments as opposed to having to go to each individual track. The other thing that's useful with, again, these sub mixes that I created is that now I can add an overall effect. For instance, if I want to add a reverb onto this drum track to give the drums a little bit more of a sense of being in the same room or being more cohesive, I can do that relatively easily. Let's just maybe not be as obnoxious. Give it a good old 9%, small room, just to give it this tighter sense of space. So these are some of the things, the final overall checks and adjustments that I'm making. Again, the way I did these submixes, remember that all I did was I went to the output section of each individual track. I used a bus, right? Because buses send audio to different areas in the audio project. And then I set that bus to go to the input of whatever auxiliary track I created. All right? So that's it for this video. I don't want to overwhelm you. And in the next video, we'll talk about actually bouncing down the audio into either a 2-track mix or into stems. All right?